there is a ship the enemy sank 5 times. Newspapers in Tokyo announced her destruction again and again. Japanese pilots swore they watched her burn in slips beneath the waves. And yet, every single time, she came back. She came back to fight, she came back to win, and she came back to earn a title no other warship in American history has ever claimed. This is the story of the USS Enterprise, hull number CV-6, the most decorated ship the United States Navy has ever put to sea. A vessel so feared and so relentless that her own crew, and even her enemies, began calling her by a name that sounded like it belonged in a legend. Rather than a war record, they called her the Gray Ghost. Stay with me for the next hour, because what this ship did across 4 brutal years of the Pacific War is not just naval history. It is one of the greatest survival stories ever recorded on the high seas. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly why sailors who served aboard her still say there was something different about this one ship, something that felt to them almost alive. Before we go further, if stories like this matter to you, stories of real ships, real sailors, and the machines that carried the weight of entire wars on their decks, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel is built entirely around bringing these forgotten legends back to life with the detail and the respect they deserve. Now, let's go back to where it all began. On a cold morning in Newport News, Virginia, in the autumn of 1936, when a hull slid down the shipways and into the water for the very first time. The USS Enterprise was the 6th ship of the United States Navy to carry that name, a name that stretched back to the earliest days of the American Republic, first given to a small schooner that fought in the Revolutionary War against the British, and carried forward through generation after generation of American warships. Each vessel that bore the name Enterprise before her had its own story of service, but none of them could have imagined what the 6th ship carrying that proud old name would go on to accomplish. She was the 3rd and final vessel of the Yorktown class of aircraft carriers, a design born out of the naval treaties of the 1920s and 1930s, agreements like the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty, which tried, and ultimately failed, to limit the size and number of the world's war fleets in the hope of preventing another catastrophic global conflict. Naval architects at the time worked within strict tonnage limitations, trying to squeeze as much speed, as much armor, and as much aircraft capacity as possible into a hull that would not violate international agreements that within a decade would be torn apart by the very war those treaties had tried to prevent. She was laid down on the 16th of July, 1934, her keel resting in the same Newport News shipyard that had built some of the finest vessels in American naval history. It took over 2 years of construction before she was finally launched on the 3rd of October, 1936, sponsored in a ceremony attended by Lou Henry Hoover, the wife of former President Herbert Hoover, who broke the traditional bottle of champagne across her bow, as thousands of shipyard workers and their families watched the enormous hull slide into the James River for the very first time. It would take nearly 2 more years of fitting out, installing her engines, her flight deck machinery, her weapon systems, and the thousands of smaller components that would transform a floating hull into a fully operational warship, before she was finally commissioned into active service on May the 12th, 1938, under the command of Captain Newton H. White. At the time of her commissioning, most of the American public, and even a significant portion of the Navy's own senior leadership, still believed that the next Great War, if it ever came, would be fought and won by battleships, by rows of enormous steel guns firing at each other across miles of open ocean, in the same style of naval combat that had defined conflicts for the previous several centuries. Aircraft carriers, in the eyes of many admirals of that era, were considered support vessels, useful for scouting enemy positions, useful for spotting the fall of shot for battleship guns, but never truly expected to become the deciding weapon of an entire war. There were, however, a small number of visionary officers within the Navy, men who had studied the emerging role of naval aviation closely, who believed that the aircraft carrier would eventually replace the battleship as the true center of naval power. Enterprise, and the war she was about to sail into, would prove those visionaries right and prove the skeptics catastrophically wrong in a way that would reshape naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. She displaced around 20,000 tons standard, growing to closer to 25,000 tons when fully loaded with fuel, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies. She stretched out to just over 800 feet in length, with a flight deck wide enough to allow her air group to launch and recover aircraft in rapid succession. Her power plant consisted of massive steam turbines capable of driving her through the water at speeds exceeding 32 knots, fast enough to outrun many of the escort vessels assigned to protect her, a design choice that reflected the Navy's growing understanding that a carrier's best defense was often simply outrunning danger, while her aircraft did the fighting from a distance. She was designed to carry roughly 90 aircraft, a mix of Wildcat fighters for air defense, Dauntless dive bombers for striking enemy ships and land targets, and Devastator torpedo bombers, later replaced by the more capable Avenger for delivering torpedo strikes against enemy warships. These aircraft, far more than any deck gun bolted to her hull, would become her true weapons, capable of reaching out and striking an enemy fleet from over 100 miles away, well beyond the range of any traditional battleship's guns. Her captains and her aircrews spent the years leading up to the war training relentlessly in the waters off the American West Coast and around Hawaii, developing tactics for a kind of combat that had never truly been tested in real battle, carrier against carrier, aircraft against aircraft, entire fleets fighting each other from over the horizon without the ships themselves ever coming into visual range of one another. Fleet exercises, known as fleet problems, were conducted year after year, refining the choreography of launching large groups of aircraft, forming them up in the air, and coordinating complex strikes against simulated enemy targets. Enterprise and her sister ships became floating laboratories for a completely new form of warfare, one that nobody aboard her in 1939 or 1940 could have known was about to be tested in the most violent and consequential way imaginable against a real enemy in a war that would decide the fate of the entire Pacific Ocean. On the 7th of December, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet was anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Row after row of battleships lined up along what the sailors called Battleship Row. Ships like the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California sitting peacefully at their moorings on what should have been an ordinary Sunday morning. Enterprise was not among them. She was at sea, roughly 200 miles west of Oahu, returning from a mission delivering a squadron of Marine fighter aircraft to reinforce the small American garrison stationed on Wake Island, a tiny, isolated outpost in the Central Pacific that the Navy considered strategically important enough to reinforce even as tensions with Japan grew more dangerous by the week. That single detail, an assignment that had nothing to do with any premonition of attack, no secret warning, no advance intelligence, simply the ordinary rhythm of a peacetime delivery mission, would go on to change the entire course of the Pacific War. Because it meant that when the Japanese carrier strike force launched its devastating surprise assault that Sunday morning, Enterprise was untouched, undamaged, and still fully combat capable, one of the very few major fleet assets the United States had left in the entire Pacific. Some of her own aircraft, in fact, were flying ahead of the ship toward Pearl Harbor that morning, sent in advance to land at Ford Island and refuel before the ship herself arrived in port, and several of these Enterprise aircraft found themselves arriving directly in the middle of the Japanese attack, caught completely by surprise, becoming some of the first American planes shot down in the entire war. A tragic and almost unbelievable coincidence of timing that meant Enterprise, despite being spared the destruction inflicted on the battleships, still lost some of her own men on that very first day of America's entry into the war. When Enterprise steamed into Pearl Harbor the following day, the 8th of December, and her crew saw the devastation with their own eyes. The burning wrecks of once proud battleships, the oil fires still spreading black smoke across the water, the bodies still being recovered from the harbor. The men aboard felt something shift inside them, something that many of them would later describe in their own words and letters home. Grief turned into a kind of cold, focused fury, and that fury would define the ship's entire wartime identity from that point forward. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force built around Enterprise, is said to have looked out over the destruction at Pearl Harbor and remarked, in words that would become famous among naval historians, that before the war was finished, the Japanese language would only be spoken in hell, a brutal and unfiltered expression of the anger that had swept through the entire Pacific Fleet in the aftermath of the attack. Within days, Enterprise was back at sea, hunting for the Japanese carriers that had launched the attack, though they had already withdrawn far beyond reach, retreating back toward the home islands of Japan long before any American counterstrike could be organized. Over the following months, through the difficult and uncertain early period of the war, Enterprise took part in a series of hit-and-run raids against Japanese-held islands across the Pacific, striking the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands in February of 1942, launching her aircraft against Japanese airfields, shipping, and installations in operations designed as much to boost American morale after the disaster at Pearl Harbor as they were to inflict serious strategic damage on the enemy. These early raids were dangerous, often flown at the very edge of the aircraft's fuel range, with pilots and aircrew fully aware that a single navigational error or mechanical failure could mean death in the vast, empty ocean with no hope of rescue. And then came one of the most audacious operations of the entire war, the extraordinary mission that sent Army Air Force B-25 bombers, twin-engine land-based aircraft never designed to operate from a ship, launched from the flight deck of Enterprise's sister carrier Hornet on the daring Doolittle raid against Tokyo itself in April of 1942. Enterprise provided crucial escort and air cover for that entire task force. Her fighters and scout planes screening the vulnerable Hornet, whose own aircraft had been struck below decks to make room for the Army bombers, meaning Hornet herself had almost no ability to defend against Japanese attack during the most dangerous phase of the mission. The raid itself did comparatively minor physical damage to Tokyo, but its psychological impact was immense, proving to the Japanese public and to their military leadership that the home islands were not untouchable. A revelation that would go on to influence major Japanese strategic decisions in the months that followed, decisions that would ultimately lead directly to the battle that made Enterprise immortal. These early operations were small in scale compared to what was coming, but they proved something important: that American carriers and American air crews could hit back, and hit back hard, even in the darkest early months of the war, when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asia. Then came June of 1942, and the Battle of Midway, arguably the single most decisive naval battle of the 20th century, and the moment where Enterprise transformed from a capable warship into a genuine legend. American codebreakers, working in a windowless basement in Hawaii under the command of Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to know that a massive fleet built around 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, was steaming toward the tiny American outpost at Midway Atoll intending to draw the remaining American carriers into a decisive trap and destroy them once and for all, finishing the job that Pearl Harbor had failed to complete. Instead, thanks to that intelligence breakthrough, the trap was reversed. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his own carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which engineers had patched together, in an astonishing 72 hours of round-the-clock repair work after being badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. In ambush position northeast of Midway, waiting for the Japanese fleet to commit itself and reveal its position. The battle that followed on the 4th of June, 1942, was chaotic, costly, and for much of the morning, it looked as though it might end in American disaster. Wave after wave of American torpedo bombers, flying the slow, vulnerable Devastator aircraft, attacked the Japanese carriers and were slaughtered almost to the last aircraft. Entire squadrons wiped out with almost nothing to show for it in terms of damage inflicted. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet is remembered to this day as one of the most tragic sacrifices in American naval history. 15 aircraft launched, and only a single pilot, George Gay, survived to tell the story, floating alone in the water beneath his overturned life raft, watching the entire battle unfold above him. But those torpedo bomber attacks, tragic as they were, pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, stripping away the fighter cover that had been protecting the carriers from attack at higher altitude. Then, almost by accident, in a moment of pure chance that historians still marvel at today, dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, arrived overhead at exactly the wrong moment for Japan and exactly the right moment for the United States. McCluskey's squadron had been searching for the Japanese fleet for hours, running low on fuel, and made the fateful decision to continue searching along the wake of a spotted Japanese destroyer rather than turn back, a gamble that led them directly to the main Japanese carrier force just as it was most vulnerable. The Japanese carriers below had decks packed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft, refueling and rearming in preparation for their own strike against the American fleet, meaning the decks were littered with exposed bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines, a floating powder keg waiting for a spark. In the space of about 6 minutes, a period of time so brief and so consequential that naval historians simply refer to it as the miracle at Midway, Enterprise's dive bombers, along with aircraft from Yorktown, turned 3 of Japan's finest carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, into flaming, sinking wrecks, their decks torn open by secondary explosions as the stored bombs and torpedoes detonated in chain reactions that no damage control team could ever hope to contain. A 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched a furious counterattack that badly damaged Yorktown, which would later be finished off by a Japanese submarine, but the Hiryu herself was located and destroyed later that same day by dive bombers, several of them once again launched from Enterprise. In that single afternoon, the balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted permanently and irreversibly, and Enterprise's air group had delivered the blow that historians still study today as one of the most consequential attacks in the history of naval warfare, a battle that stripped Japan of the core of its carrier-striking power at the very moment it needed that power most. But Midway was only the beginning of Enterprise's war, not the end of it. Over the following months, the fighting shifted south to a small jungle-covered island most Americans had never heard of before 1942, called Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands chain. This campaign would become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most brutal in the entire Pacific War. A grinding 6-month struggle fought simultaneously on land, at sea, and in the air, and Enterprise was in the thick of it from the very start. In August of 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Enterprise came under sustained Japanese air attack and took several direct bomb hits tearing through her flight deck and killing dozens of her crew. Sailors who had survived Midway just weeks earlier now paying the price of continuous, unrelenting combat operations. She limped away to Pearl Harbor for repairs, her wounded flight deck patched together by exhausted repair crews working around the clock. But she was back in the fight within weeks because the Navy simply could not afford to keep her sidelined, not when so few American carriers remained operational in the Pacific at that stage of the war. Then, in October of 1942, came the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, one of the most punishing engagements Enterprise would ever endure in her entire wartime career. Japanese dive bombers pressed home their attacks with terrifying determination, diving through a wall of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black bursts of smoke, and Enterprise absorbed hit after hit, explosions tearing through her hull, fires raging across multiple decks, casualties mounting by the hour, as damage control parties fought desperately to keep the ship afloat and operational. At one devastating point during this period of the war, following the combined losses of other American carriers, including the sinking of the Hornet at that very battle, Enterprise stood as the only operational fleet carrier the United States had left in the entire Pacific Ocean. Think carefully about the weight of that single fact. The outcome of the war against Japan, for a period of real documented time, rested on the survival of one badly damaged, heavily patched, exhausted ship and her crew, sailing alone in enemy-dominated waters with no reinforcement available if she too were lost. Japanese radio propaganda actually announced during this period that Enterprise had been sunk, not once, but repeatedly, a claim so frequently repeated that it became something of a dark joke among Enterprise's own crew, who found the announcements almost darkly funny given that they were, quite obviously, still very much alive and still very much fighting, patching holes in their own flight deck, even as Tokyo Rose announced their destruction to the world over the airwaves. This is, in fact, where the nickname the Gray Ghost truly took hold, a name born directly from the surreal experience of an entire crew listening to enemy radio broadcasts declaring their own deaths. While they stood on the very deck the broadcasts claimed no longer existed, repaired again at Pearl Harbor, her hull strengthened and her systems restored, Enterprise sailed back into combat throughout 1943 and into 1944, taking part in the long, grinding island-hopping campaign that slowly, methodically, and at enormous human cost pushed Japanese forces back across the Pacific toward their home islands. She fought in the Gilbert Islands campaign in November of 1943, providing air support for the brutal amphibious landings at Tarawa, one of the costliest single battles of the entire Pacific War for American Marines. She fought in the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944 and took part in the devastating raid against the massive Japanese naval base at Truk Atoll, sometimes called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, an operation that caught the Japanese fleet largely by surprise and destroyed dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft in a single overwhelming strike. By this stage of the war, Enterprise had also become a pioneer of night carrier operations, launching and recovering aircraft after dark, an extraordinarily dangerous and technically demanding capability that required pilots of exceptional skill and nerves of steel, landing high-performance aircraft on a pitching, out flight deck with almost no visual reference points, a capability that gave the American fleet an advantage the Japanese simply could not match as the war progressed. In June of 1944 came the enormous Battle of the Philippine Sea, a battle so lopsided in America's favor that pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as swarms of Japanese aircraft, flown increasingly by inexperienced replacement pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs as Japan's veteran aircrew losses mounted, were shot out of the sky in staggering numbers by American fighter pilots, flying superior aircraft With vastly more combat experience, Enterprise's air group contributed heavily to this lopsided victory, one of the most complete aerial triumphs of the entire war, a battle that effectively destroyed what remained of Japan's carrier-based air power and its ability to train new pilots fast enough to replace their catastrophic losses. In October of 1944 came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in the history of the world, fought across the waters surrounding the Philippines. As American forces returned to liberate the islands they had been driven from, in the dark days of 1942, fulfilling General Douglas MacArthur's famous promise that he would return, Enterprise's aircraft took part in the massive strikes that helped cripple the Japanese surface fleet. During this sprawling, multi-day battle, contributing to a victory that effectively ended Japan's ability to fight as an organized naval power for the remainder of the war. But it was here, during its campaign, that a horrifying new weapon began appearing in the skies above the American fleet. Aircraft deliberately crashed into ships by pilots who had no intention of surviving the attack. Young men sent on missions from which there was no possibility of return. The kamikaze had arrived, born out of Japan's desperation and its recognition that conventional air attacks could no longer inflict meaningful damage against increasingly well-defended American ships. And Enterprise, like every carrier in the fleet, would soon feel the full, terrible weight of this new and desperate form of warfare. By the spring of 1945, the fighting had moved to Okinawa, the last major island, standing between the American fleet and the Japanese home islands themselves, a battle that would become the bloodiest of the entire Pacific War, foreshadowing the horrific casualties that military planners feared an actual invasion of Japan would bring. Enterprise operated for weeks off Okinawa, her aircraft flying strike after strike in support of the Marines and Army troops fighting their way across the island against fanatical Japanese resistance, while overhead, wave after wave of kamikaze aircraft threw themselves at the American fleet in numbers never before seen in the war. It was here, on the 14th of May, 1945, that Enterprise suffered what would become her final, and in many ways most dramatic, wound of the war. A single Japanese kamikaze pilot dove almost vertically out of the clouds, evading the fleet's defensive fire despite everything the ship's gunners threw into the sky to stop him, and slammed directly into her flight deck near the forward elevator. The resulting explosion hurled the massive elevator platform, weighing many tons, hundreds of feet into the air, an image so violent and so surreal that photographs of the moment remain some of the most striking and widely reproduced images of the entire Pacific War. The great steel elevator tumbling end over end against the sky like something out of a nightmare. 14 of her crew were killed in the attack, young men who had, in many cases, already survived years of combat aboard this same ship, only to lose their lives in her final battle. The damage was severe enough that Enterprise, remarkably, would never again see combat before the war's end, just 3 months later. The Gray Ghost, the ship that had survived Pearl Harbor's aftermath, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, was finally forced out of the fight, not sunk, not destroyed, simply too damaged to continue. A wound she carried like a final, hard-earned scar, a testament to just how much punishment this one vessel had absorbed across nearly 4 unbroken years of war. When the guns finally fell silent in August of 1945, following the surrenders in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship Missouri, the United States Navy sat down to count the cost and the achievements of its most storied vessel. What they found was staggering, a record that no historian or naval statistician has ever seen matched before or since. Enterprise had earned 20 battle stars for her service in the Second World War, more than any other American warship of the entire conflict, a number that reflects not just her longevity, but her presence at nearly every single major turning point of the Pacific Campaign. She received the Presidential Unit Citation and the Navy Unit Commendation, the highest honors the Navy can bestow upon an entire ship and crew collectively, recognizing extraordinary heroism performed not by a single individual, but by the ship as a whole, fighting as one unit through the worst the war could throw at her. Her aircraft were credited with sinking or helping to sink dozens of Japanese warships across the course of the war, including numerous aircraft carriers, and her air group was responsible for shooting down hundreds of enemy aircraft, figures that place her air wing among the most lethal and effective combat units of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, the man who commanded the entire Pacific Fleet throughout the war, once said that the war in the Pacific had been won largely on the decks of one ship, and that was Enterprise, an extraordinary statement from the most senior naval commander in the theater, and one that historians have found little reason to dispute in the decades since. No other vessel in the history of the United States Navy has ever matched her combined record of battle honors, survival, and sheer consistent presence at nearly every pivotal turning point of an entire war, from the desperate defensive struggles of 1942 to the overwhelming offensive victories of 1944 and 1945. And yet, for all of that, the story of Enterprise does not end the way you might expect for a ship this decorated and this beloved by the men who served aboard her. After the war, plans were drawn up to preserve her as a permanent floating memorial, a museum ship that future generations could walk aboard and see, with their own eyes, the deck where history had been made, where McCluskey's dive bombers had launched toward Midway, where the elevator had been thrown hundreds of feet into the sky off Okinawa. Fundraising campaigns were launched, led in large part by the veterans who had served aboard her and who understood, perhaps better than anyone, just how significant this ship's story truly was. Veterans groups pushed hard for her preservation, writing letters, organizing committees, and appealing directly to Congress and to the American public for support. But in the difficult economic climate of the 1950s, with the country's attention shifting toward the Cold War and newer, more modern vessels, the money never fully materialized. The government showed little appetite for spending scarce post-war funds on preserving an aging carrier when there were pressing budgetary demands elsewhere. In 1958, after years sitting in reserve at Bayonne, New Jersey, slowly rusting and largely forgotten by a public that had moved on to new concerns, the ship that could not be sunk by any enemy in 4 years of brutal war was quietly sold for scrap and broken apart for her steel. It remains, to this day, one of the most painful and controversial decisions in the history of American naval preservation, a decision that many historians and veterans alike still consider a national embarrassment. A ship that survived kamikazes, dive bombers, and torpedoes, ultimately undone not by an enemy, but by budget lines and bureaucratic delay, cut apart piece by piece in a scrapyard, while the men who had fought and bled aboard her could only watch from a distance, powerless to stop it. Her name, though, refused to disappear, carried forward by the very Navy that had once let her be scrapped. In 1961, the United States Navy commissioned a new Enterprise, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, CV-65, an extraordinary vessel in her own right that carried the name and the legacy of CV-6 into an entirely new era of naval power, one defined by nuclear propulsion, jet aircraft, and a completely different kind of global reach. That ship itself served for over 50 remarkable years, deploying around the world through the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and numerous conflicts that followed, before her own eventual retirement in the 21st century. And today, a brand new Enterprise, a Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, one of the most advanced warships ever constructed, carries the name forward once again ensuring that 6 generations after that first hull slid into the water at Newport News, the name Enterprise still commands the ocean, still represents American naval power on the world stage. So what do we take from this story? From 4 years in the life of a single ship that Japan declared sunk again and again, a ship that stood alone as America's last operational carrier at the darkest hour of the Pacific War, a ship that helped turn the tide at Midway, bled at Santa Cruz, and absorbed a kamikaze strike at Okinawa, without ever truly being defeated, without ever surrendering the fight, even as she was torn apart again and again by an enemy determined to destroy her. We take, I think, a reminder that history is not only made by nations and by generals, it is made quite literally by the steel decks and the ordinary young men who stood on them, many of them barely out of high school, who launched aircraft into darkness and fire and uncertainty, and who kept coming back, mission after mission, year after year, because the alternative was unthinkable. The Gray Ghost earned her nickname the hard way, through smoke, through fire, through loss, and through an almost impossible refusal to stay down. She was, by every measure the Navy keeps, the single most decorated warship in American history. And there has never been another quite like her since. A ship whose story deserves to be remembered, not just by historians, but by anyone who wants to understand what courage, sacrifice, and sheer relentless endurance actually look like when tested by the worst that war can offer. Now, I want to ask you something, and I would genuinely love to read your answer in the comments below. If you could have stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise during just one moment of her incredible war, the desperate hours at Midway, the terrifying attacks off Santa Cruz, or the final kamikaze strike at Okinawa, which single moment would you choose to have witnessed with your own eyes, and why? Take a moment, write it down, and let's talk about it together. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, do me one simple favor before you go. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and turn on notifications, because there are so many more forgotten stories of naval history, air power, and military courage still waiting to be told, and I do not want you to miss a single one of them. Thank you for spending this hour with me and with the Gray Ghost. I will see you in the next one.